more of their own take-home pay. The difference is we make sure our kids inherit a debt-free future. The difference is we do what's necessary to create a healthy economy, more take-home pay, faster economic growth, and better jobs. That's why we're here to balance the budget. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Wisconsin reserves. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, last fall, throughout this country, we had a vigorous debate. President Obama laid out his vision of how we deal with some of our big challenges with respect to the economy and the budget. Governor Romney did the same thing. And both of them said the American people faced a very important and fundamental choice. And the American people chose. They chose to support President Obama's vision of accelerating economic growth, putting more people back to work, taking a shared responsibility approach to our long-term deficits so we bring them down in a balanced, smart way. And they rejected the idea that we're going to move the economy forward by giving windfall tax cuts to the very wealthiest in the country, and that somehow the benefits of that would trickle down and lift everybody up. They rejected that lopsided approach that balanced the budgets on the backs of everybody but the folks at the very top. Balanced the budget on the backs of our kids' education by slashing important investments. In that category of spending that we make these important investments for our country and our future, they double the cut from the sequester. So those are our investments in our kids' education. Those are our investments in science and research to help power our economy. Those are our investments to help modernize our infrastructure. They cut transportation by 15% when we have 15% unemployment in the construction industry. So, Mr. Chairman, the American people rejected the kind of uncompromising, lopsided approach that we see once again presented here in the House. The same thing we've seen for the last 3 years, as if we hadn't even had a debate last fall. Now, in the Democratic alternative, we focus on the main issue right now and in the future. We don't only want strong economic growth in the future, we want to see accelerated job growth right now. You know, we've seen some momentum in the jobs market in the last couple months. But the Republican budget, it will put the brakes on that growth. Now, the chairman of the Budget Committee can quote economists all he wants. There are economists that say that we'll do this or won't do this or we'll do that. But we have an umpire here in the Congress. We have a referee. They're called the Congressional Budget Office. They're nonpartisan. They're independent. They tell us that if you follow the approach of the Republican budget and keep the sequester in place through the end of this year, that by the end of this year, we will have 750,000 fewer Americans working than otherwise. Why would we want to do that? They tell us that if you take the approach followed by the Republican budget, that economic growth this calendar year will be cut by 1/3. Why would we want to do that? Because the Congressional Budget Office also tells us that a full half of our deficit this year, half, is as a result of the fact that there's still lots of people looking for work who haven't found a job. And they project that 3/4 of the deficit next year in 2014 is as a result of the fact that you have too many people who are unemployed. So let's attack the root of the problem right now and help put people back to work rather than put the brakes on the economy. And that's what our budget will do. This calendar year, in addition to preventing the 750,000 loss, we will generate another 450,000 jobs by investing in the economy. And next year, the difference between our plan and our colleagues' plan is 2 million jobs, 2 million more jobs under our budget proposal. So we believe that you got to deal with the budget deficit, and at the same time, you also need to focus on the jobs deficit to help deal with the budget deficit. Now, we also reduce the deficit in a steady, sustained way. We do it with balance. We do it with targeted cuts, But we also do it, Mr. Chairman, by eliminating some of the tax breaks and tax expenditures for very high-income individuals. We heard from Governor Romney and we heard from the chairman of the Budget Committee last fall and this year that there are trillions of dollars of tax expenditures that disproportionately benefit very wealthy people. So under the Republican plan, they say, well, we're going to get rid of some of your tax expenditure for high-income people, but we're going to bring down your top rate. So in the end, the folks at the very top actually get a big windfall. We say, let's eliminate some of those tax breaks for very wealthy people in order to help reduce our deficit. So when you combine that savings with targeted cuts, you can reduce it in a balanced way, rather than increasing the tax burden on the middle class, which is what their budget will do. We also want to make sure we keep our commitments to our seniors and not transfer the risk and cost of rising health care costs onto the backs of seniors as our Republican budget does. We don't reopen the prescription drug donut hole as the Republican budget does, which means that seniors with high prescription drug costs will end up paying thousands more out of pocket over the period of this budget. We in our budget make sure that student loan interest rates, which are set to double in July from 3.4% to 6.8%, we make sure they don't double. The Republican budget makes sure that they do, and that will make college less affordable to millions of students. So, Mr. Chairman, let me conclude by talking about the deficit impacts. Because the Republican budget does hit this, they say they're going to hit this political target of balance in 10 years. But it's a hoax, because they say at the same time that their budget balances that they're repealing all of Obamacare, all of the Affordable Care Act. The reality, Mr. Chairman, is they get rid of all the benefits of the Affordable Care Act. So the millions of Americans who would have had more affordable coverage, they won't get it. And the people who will no longer be excluded from getting coverage because of pre-existing conditions, they'll make sure that they're denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions because they take away the benefits. But the dirty little secret, Mr. Chairman, is they keep the savings from the Affordable Care Act, from Obamacare. And without those savings, that budget doesn't balance. So if we did what our Republican colleagues here say they want to do, which is like this instant, repeal Obamacare, they wouldn't have a budget that was in balance. You don't have to take my word for it. The Heritage Foundation just issued a statement, very conservative think tank. Quote, perhaps the biggest shortcoming of this budget, meaning the Republican budget, is that it keeps the tax increases associated with Obamacare. It keeps those. It keeps all the savings in Medicare that were achieved as part of the Affordable Care Act, where we achieved them by reducing the overpayments to the private insurance companies, by changing the incentive structure to focus more on the quality of care rather than quantity of care. You remember all those Medicare savings that we heard our colleagues demagogue in the last election last fall? They keep all those savings, and their budget wouldn't balance without them. Now, our budget dramatically cuts the deficit, makes sure that our deficits are not growing faster than the economy, down to 2.4% by the end of the window. We stabilize the debt below where the CBO projects today. We've stabilized 70% GDP. And yes, we also will balance our budget in the same year that the Republican budget from last year balanced. If this were just a race to balance the budget first, then people should vote for the Republican Study Group proposal, 4 years. But if your priority is jobs and economic growth, as it should be as part of a measured and balanced approach to reducing the deficit, then you need to support the Democratic alternative. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
I yield myself 30 seconds to say the gentleman from Maryland's right. Yes, we do balance the budget. Guilty. Proud to be guilty of that. We think balancing the budget is important. And more to the point, in the revenues, we're saying we don't like this current tax code, so we can raise the same amount of revenue to the government with a better tax system, one that's pro-growth, one that creates jobs, and that's precisely what the Ways and Means Committee is doing. And that does not include the Obamacare taxes, but it includes replacing the current revenue code that hurts jobs and hurts economic growth. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a senior member of the Budget Committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, is recognized for 3 minutes.
And I thank the Speaker. Today I rise because today's budget is a budget that helps Americans' families. I rise today to support a budget that recognizes that the status quo is not only unacceptable to American families, but it's also unsustainable to the economy. You know, this budget that's before us now will finally restore much-needed certainty to the economy, promote fairness, and provide those American families with the opportunity they are looking for to prosper. Importantly, this budget stops spending money that we simply do not have, and at the same time it advances really what are common sense changes and proposals to strengthen our nation's safety net programs, and we do that for American families. So the path to prosperity takes us the first step, really, towards reversing the path to debt and decline, the ones that the President and his fellow Democrats have laid out for the American public. You know, to say that President Obama and the Democrats over in the Senate, to say that they have failed to lead this nation in what is probably one of the most predictable economic crises in our nation's history, well, that would be a drastic understatement. Why is that? Well, on February 4th, the President's budget, it was due. On March 19th, the American people, well, they were still waiting. It was over 4 times in 5 years that this President has failed to, well, basically follow the law of the land and to submit a budget on time. You know, it's interesting that the President's brackets, they're always on time. His budgets, not so much. You know, the Senate Democrats, they're really not any better. It took them, well, almost 4 years to produce a budget that increases government spending by $265 billion, raises taxes on this country by almost $1 trillion, and at the same time of all that, it cuts health care providers by almost $300 billion. You know, over the period covered by the budget, deficits under the Senate plan, they're going to be nearly $4 trillion. Yes, $4 trillion larger than those under the House Republican budget that we're talking about right now. Look, every family in the country, every family in America, they understand the necessity of having a balanced budget. The President and Senate Democrats could surely learn by going back to their districts and learning from the examples of American families across the country and how to set a budget. See, families, they don't have the luxury of waiting for the next election. They don't have the luxury, if you will, of going through yet another cycle. And quite frankly, as we stand here today in Washington, neither does Washington. So let's stop the spending insanity, if you will. Let's start putting the country back on track, and let's do this for the American family. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, who recognizes how important it is to keep our economy moving forward, not backwards.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this ill-conceived budget. For working families, this budget could mean a tax hit of $2,000, making it harder for families to afford rent and put food on the table. The GOP plan also shortchanges seniors, ending Medicare in 10 years. Equally problematic, the Affordable Care Act will be repealed, reducing health care assistance to 176,000 families in my district and preventing 68,000 young people in my part of New York from staying on their parents' insurance. We can also expect our economy to take a hit, with 2 million jobs vanishing next year alone. Is this what we need to get this economy growing again? And for small businesses, this budget will mean losses. 16,000 small firms in my district will lose tax assistance when purchasing health care, and thousands of would-be entrepreneurs around the country will see technical assistance and other services dried up, preventing the creation of new startups and blocking job creation. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, budgets should be about priorities. The American people rejected these flawed priorities last year when they voted to re-elect President Barack Obama. I urge my colleagues to vote no so that we can approve a budget that is balanced, that is fair, that will create jobs, and that will move our nation forward together. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I rise in strong support of this budget resolution. I just want to take a moment, too, to applaud the chairman and the members of his committee, and especially the hardworking staff of his committee for producing this document. A mere little band of less than 30 staffers. By contrast, the President, with all the vast resources at his disposal in the executive branch, is now, I think, into the 6th week beyond his deadline in which he cannot pass his own budget. I assume that he will one day submit something. I hope that we'll have a chance to vote on it. I'll be curious to see if our colleagues on the other side of the aisle can produce more than the 0 votes that his budget produced last year. The Senate, however, is even worse. They haven't produced a budget in 4 years. After seeing the budget that they will vote on, I now know perhaps why they did not produce such a document. It has over $1.5 trillion in new taxes, almost $1 trillion that are recognized, almost $500 billion to replace sequestration in unspecified closures of so-called loopholes, and another $100 billion in unspecified closures for new and ultimately failed stimulus spending. And it never reaches balance, ever. The only thing we hear from balance on the Senate or the President is as a euphemism for new tax increases. And finally, I want to point out that the last time the Senate passed a budget 4 years ago, I was a captain in the United States Army sitting at Forward Operating Base Medorlam in northeast Afghanistan. And I want to specifically single out the defense measures in this budget and to applaud again the leadership of the chairman and the Budget Committee for protecting our military, for giving it funding that it otherwise would not have and the flexibility it needs to help protect and keep this country safe. The Defense Department is the one area in government where the strategy should drive the budget, not the budget driving the strategy. And then the second way that it protects our military from a debt crisis. This budget, as we've heard, is designed to postpone and ultimately prevent a debt crisis caused by out-of-control, reckless spending, and anemic economic growth of the kinds you've seen in countries in Europe already. If that were to happen, not only would it impact families all across the country when their interest rates for mortgages and farms and small businesses and education increases, but it also crowd out all other kinds of priorities in our federal budget. So it would immediately impact as well our troops, their families, and our veterans. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the Republican budget does follow some of our European friends, but follows them in the wrong way. The strategy places like the UK have followed is an austerity approach. Immediate, deep cuts. And guess what that did? That sent them back into a recession. And again, the umpire around this place, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, says that if you take the approach in our Republican colleagues' budget, you will have 750,000 fewer jobs by the end of this year. That is not a growth strategy. We cannot afford here in the United States the European-style austerity plan that is hurting those economies. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, our ranking member on the Financial Services Committee, Ms. Waters.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Mr. Van Hollen for yielding me time. Today I rise in strong opposition to the Republicans' budget, a budget that makes absurd claims to reducing the deficit by repealing crucial government authority to protect our economy, lest we forget that Lehman Brothers' disorderly bankruptcy sparked the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Should a megabank fail in the future, Dodd-Frank Act specifically authorizes regulators to dissolve the failing firm, fire its executives, wipe out shareholders, and deny the claims of creditors. The gentleman from Wisconsin calls this a bailout, erroneously, concluding that the Dodd-Frank Act enshrines too big to fail when, in fact, it provides all the necessary tools to end it. If Dodd-Frank actually did what the Republicans say, why does no large firm want to be designated as systemically significant? The Republican proposal also deceptively suggests that a repeal of the liquidation authority generates real savings to the American taxpayer. The Dodd-Frank legislation designed this authority to pay for itself over time, with any initial upfront costs being completely recouped by selling assets and imposing an assessment after the resolution on financial institutions with more than $50 billion in assets. The law specifically states that taxpayers shall bear no losses from the exercise of any authority under the liquidation title. Once again, the Republican budget is misleading and dishonest. The National Journal has called the Republican proposal a budget gimmick, and even the Wall Street Journal dismissed it as mere budget quirks. If the authority to wind down a mega firm is repealed, the American taxpayer would be called on again to bear the risk of another financial crisis like 2008, which the GAO found cost the U.S. economy $13 trillion. Mr. Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to reject this Republican budget. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, let me give myself 1 minute to respond.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
My friend from Maryland, he keeps saying, you know, the CBO says that this plan is going to cost 750,000 jobs. That's an analysis done on the sequester, starting with looking at calendar year January through calendar year December. Well, where are we? This budget doesn't deal with fiscal year 2013. It starts in October. So he's using a comparison of a statistic that they use, the same kind of economic short-term analysis they use to say that the stimulus would create millions of new jobs. They use the same kind of analysis and say that the sequester will cost these jobs, and it is in a cut that isn't even in this budget. More to the point, the Senate Democratic budget has the same appropriations number we have in our budget for fiscal year 2014. The point is, what the CBO does say over the long term is if you achieve this kind of deficit reduction we are, 1 million new jobs a year by the end of the budget window. 1.7% faster economic growth. CBO says that about this budget, about achieving this kind of deficit reduction. Stanford economists. You could create 1 million jobs a year. So you're seeing a consistent theme here. Cutting spending, growing the economy, creating jobs. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the senior member of the Budget Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Campbell.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I don't know if you've been to Spain or not, but I have, just once. But it's a beautiful country, nice people, great food, and at one time, a large, vibrant, and growing economy. But not today. Today in Spain, over half of people under 25 years old can't find work. The unemployment amongst all ages in Spain is about what we had during the Great Depression, not the Great Recession, the Great Depression of the 30s. And people on government medical care there can't get it. They can't get it when they want it because they've had to close a lot of these medical clinics in order to save money. They had to do that because they waited too long to fix their fiscal problems. They waited till they had a debt crisis. And then they had to do what my friend from Maryland said. They had to impose an austerity program. They raised taxes and cut spending very quickly, in a matter of just a year or so, because that's what they had to do to continue being able to sell their debt. That, Mr. Chairman, is exactly what we don't want to do. This is not speculation. This is not something we have to think about. It's there for us to see, and not just in Spain and Greece and Cyprus, in Japan in a different form. It's there in other parts of the world. When you borrow so much money that people won't lend you any anymore, then you put in this austerity which causes these problems. Unfortunately, that is what my friends on the other side of the aisle, their budgets will lead us to. More debts, more deficit, kind of a sugar high. They'll say, oh yeah, we're going to spend all this money, we'll create all these government jobs for a while and we'll feel good. Till the debt crisis comes, and then all that goes away. What the Republican budget does is balances in 10 years, and not so that CPAs like me can achieve some symmetry that makes us feel good. It's because when you balance a budget, you set this balance up. It frees up the economy. People know that we're on that track to balance in 10 years. We won't have a debt crisis. People will know we won't have a debt crisis. The economy is freed up from the burden of too much debt, of knowing that there's a problem with no solution. There will now be a problem with a solution. The economy will be freed up both on the government side and on the private sector, and there will be more jobs and more jobs. That's what the Republican budget promises, an economy that grows and sustainable job creation, not a 1 or 2 year sugar high followed by a collapse. We've seen what not to do. We know the path not to take. This Republican budget is the path we should take, and I hope everyone will support it, and I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to point out again that our Republican colleagues cannot have it both ways. You can't claim you're in balance in 10 years and claim that you got rid of all of the Obamacare provisions, because if you look at this chart, you will see that in the year 2023, 10 years from now, they claim a balance of about $7 billion right there. And yet, if you look at this blue section here and the red section, you've got the revenues from the Affordable Care Act, from Obamacare, and the savings from Medicare that our colleagues campaigned against last fall, but they kept them right in their budget. And without those items, they don't come close to balance. In fact, they're about $400 billion short in the 10th year from balance. Now, we believe you've got to focus on getting the economy moving right now. That's why we call in our budget for getting rid of and replacing the sequester now, so you achieve the same deficit reduction over a longer, more measured, targeted period of time and don't do damage to the economy. And we reduce the deficit in a steady way so that it's way down below the growth in the economy by the 10-year window. And we do it in a way that is balanced, meaning we ask for shared responsibility. So we do it through a combination of cuts, but also we do say for folks at the very high end of the income ladder, we can get rid of some of those tax expenditures that our Republican colleagues have talked about, but not simply to reduce the rates for high-income individuals, but to help reduce the deficit as part of a balanced approach. Now, if you look at the math on the Republicans' tax reform plan, it drops the top rate for folks at the very top from 39% all the way to 25%. We know that's going to cost about $4 trillion. They say they're going to make all that money up by taking tax expenditures away just from high-income people. The math doesn't work that way. You're going to have to increase taxes on middle-income taxpayers, or you're not going to hit your deficit target, one or the other. So in the Budget Committee, we Democrats said, look, let's say to the Ways and Means Committee, when you do tax reform, don't raise taxes on middle-income taxpayers. And we had an amendment. Got it right here. Protect the American middle class from tax increases. We said if you're going to do tax reform, at least make the commitment that you're not going to increase taxes on middle-income families in order to finance tax breaks for the folks at the very top. Every one of our Republican colleagues on the committee voted no on that amendment. Committee's got lots of policy instructions on other stuff, but a policy request statement about not increasing taxes on the middle class, they all voted no. So we believe we have to reduce our deficits in a smart and vigorous but also balanced way, asking for shared responsibility going forward, not violating our commitments to seniors by reopening the donut hole, not by shredding Medicaid, which they cut by over $810 billion, and which would be one-third less in 2023 than it would otherwise be. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, I just want to remind people that two-thirds of Medicaid spending goes to seniors and individuals with disabilities. So it's not a question of whether we reduce our long-term deficits, it's how we do it, and we do it in a balanced way. If this was just a race to be the first to balance, then you should support not the chairman's budget, support the Republican study group, that other budget. But if your priority is to grow jobs in the economy, then you should support the Democratic alternative budget, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I will yield myself such time as I may consume
The gentleman's recognized.
quickly respond. So here's what my friend is saying, and I have three problems with what my friend from Maryland said. I have a problem with what he said in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end of what he said about all of what is happening here. Here's his plan for economic growth. Borrow more money and go and spend that money. Remember the stimulus? They're saying do it again. Then raise taxes. That's going to help the economy. Oh, and it's a balanced plan. Here's the problem. Their balanced plan doesn't balance the budget. We actually asked the CBO. They're claiming they'll balance the budget in 2040. The CBO doesn't verify that. They're having to make assumptions that the CBO won't even back up to claim that they can somehow balance the budget. But when I look at their deficits in their budget, yeah, they get the deficits going down in the first few years, and then it starts going back up. How on earth do you tax $1.2 trillion, net increase spending, and claim you're balancing the budget? Look, we've been trying this economic program for a while. We tried the borrowing and the spending. That didn't work. We just hit the economy with a $1.6 trillion tax increase. The economy's not roaring right now. And what they're saying is, let's do that all over again. We are saying, fix the tax code, replace it with a pro-growth tax system that helps small businesses, that helps job creators, that helps families. Get government spending appetite under control. The government is supposed to be spending 5% a year on average over the next 10 years. That's too much. That's more than the family budget gets. We say bring it down to 3.4% a year. And so when you take a look at all of the smoke and mirrors, all of the claims, none of the Democratic budgets that are being brought to the floor here ever balance the budget. How is that a balanced plan? Balancing the budget is what every family does. Balancing the budget is what every business does. Balancing the budget is what every local government does. Surely our federal government can do this. And one of the key ingredients to growing this economy, to making American businesses big and small competitive so that they can create jobs and give people more take-home pay, is to reform our tax system. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who's in charge of reforming our tax system, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of a federal budget that balances so we can strengthen our economy, create more jobs, and allow American workers to start seeing an increase in their paychecks again. I know we can do it. I was a part of a team, a Republican Congress and a Democrat President, that balanced the budget for the first time in a generation. We focused on areas where we agreed, and we made some tough choices, and we should do that again. And balancing the budget is not just about the economy. It's about critical programs like Medicare and Social Security and the benefits they provide to millions of Americans. Social Security is already spending more money than it brings in, and the Medicare Trust Fund is going broke fast. What does that mean? Well, if Congress and the President don't act, America's seniors will face significant benefit cuts. That means smaller Social Security checks, up to 25% less, and fewer doctors willing to take Medicare. So what should we do? First, we pass a budget that balances, and that's what Republicans are doing. The Democrat substitute continues a policy of borrowing and spending and raising taxes and never gets to balance. Our budget, with pro-growth tax reform, has been scored by outside experts to create 1 million jobs in the first year alone. Second, we need to look at the areas where we agree with the President and start making the reforms necessary to save programs like Social Security and Medicare. The President said he's willing to use a different formula, change CPI to determine Social Security benefit increases. I know that policy will be included in the RSC budget. It's an area of agreement between the parties. Well, Mr. President, if we agree, then let's do it. The same goes for reducing Medicare subsidies.
Gentleman, extra minute.
The gentleman's time has yet to expire, but
Okay,
gentleman, one more minute.
Thank you. The same goes for reducing Medicare subsidies for wealthier seniors. The American people expect us to make progress where we can. Let's not let our differences stand in the way. And if we agree on a policy, let's come together to start protecting and preserving critical programs like Social Security and Medicare. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we actually have a kind of a yardstick that we can use to measure whether these budget approaches have a balanced approach, meaning that they ask for shared responsibility. You had the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission report, and they said we should reduce our deficits in a steady way through a combination of revenue, but also targeted cuts. This Republican budget is totally lopsided. It provides tax windfalls to folks at the very top and balances the budget at the expense of everybody else. What we've proposed, actually, when you take into account the $1.5 trillion in cuts we made over the last couple of years and the $700 billion in revenue from January and what we have in this budget, we actually have a higher ratio of cuts to revenue than that bipartisan Simpson-Bowles plan when you look at everything that's embedded in it. So that's measured against a bipartisan approach. And that gets us to where we need to be without hitting all the other priorities we have in our country. And with that, let me yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, the distinguished ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, who has looked at these numbers backwards and forwards, and I look forward to his comments.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection, so ordered.
This Republican budget is tone deaf, the result of blind ideology. But you know, I've been listening to what's been said so far today, and the Republicans say, but they don't say how. We've just heard, we know we can do it, but you don't say how. So what we come up with on the Republican side is a mirage, and I think a dangerous one. Let me give you an example talking about their proposals on taxes. Under their budget, the top rate is to be reduced from 39.6% to 25%. The AMT will be repealed. The corporate tax rate will be cut from 35 to 25%. But you don't find one syllable in the Republican budget on how all these tax cuts will be paid for. They don't identify a single tax policy that will end. The Republican budget would mean a huge tax cut for the very wealthy, several $100,000 a year, and leave a nearly $6 trillion hole in the deficit that would lead to tax increases for middle-income families. That isn't balance. That's total imbalance. At the same time, Republicans propose cutting $3.3 trillion from programs for people with low or moderate incomes, including hundreds of billions of dollars from food, nutrition, and Medicaid programs. So I want to end by asking the Republicans, when they come and talk about their tax proposals, to name a specific that they would address. It's not in the Republican budget. Name one, name two, name three. Otherwise, it's worse than empty.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Chair. I also thank Chairman Ryan for his distinguished leadership in bringing this budget to the floor. I rise in high support of it. I also am very proud. It's one of the highest honors I have had in my short time here to serve on this committee, not because of Chairman Ryan only, but because of the members. My members, I mean Republican members and Democrat members. I note for the record that Mr. Levin is not a member of the Budget Committee, but there are great people who are. That's why, and it's perhaps because of some of that pride, that I'm disappointed to hear the ranking member characterize the accomplishment, because that's what it is, the accomplishment of balancing within 10 years as some sort of political goal. You know, families who are trying to put food on the table, associations, neighborhood associations, nonprofits, for-profit businesses for that matter, that have to make a budget balance every day, every month, every year, I think should be offended by that characterization. It's not a political goal. You know what's political, Mr. Chair, is never balancing. You know what's political is the immoral idea that we are going to put more on our plate now, add up deficit after deficit, create a bigger and bigger debt, and then make people who don't even exist yet pay for it. Why is that political? Because, you know what, Mr. Chair? The people in the here and now can vote. Generations in the future, our grandkids who don't yet exist, can't vote. And that's what makes the other approaches we've heard about immoral, wrong, political. We balance. We balance within 10 years. Now let's contrast that a bit, our responsible approach, to what the Senate Democrats have done, for example. Next year alone, the Senate Democrats' budget increases spending by $162 billion above what we're spending today. Over 10 years, it increases our debt by $7.3 trillion from today's levels, despite a massive tax hike that they have. And that tax hike adds $1.5 trillion in new taxes. So even after that, they still add to the debt, our kids' debt, our grandkids' debt, by $7.3 trillion. And again, Mr. Chair, it never balances. After 4 years and $6 trillion in debt since a budget was last even passed, the Senate Democrats' vague proposal leaves America with even more debt and government that never stops growing. And amazingly, after 4 years, the Democrats were unable to identify any real reforms, no tax reform and no entitlement reform. It's simply not a serious proposal. I stand again in support of the House budget because it's responsible, it's real, it balances in 10 years, and it's the last thing from political, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
You know what's wrong, Mr. Chairman? What's wrong is to pretend to the American people that you can have it all ways. What's wrong is to pretend that you've got a budget that's in balance in 10 years and pretend that you're getting rid of all of the Affordable Care Act, all of Obamacare. What's wrong is going around the country demagoguing $715 billion in Medicare savings, which we achieved by ending overpayments to private insurance companies in Medicare, by demagoguing that, and then using it to balance your budget and then saying, you know what, we didn't use it to balance our budget. That's what people don't like, is people trying to have it all ways. Now, we have taken an approach to steadily and rapidly reduce our deficits in a way that doesn't interfere and hurt economic and job growth right now. And we do it in a balanced way. And what I find astounding, is to hear our Republican colleagues talk about the deficit and the debt in one breath, and then talk about all those tax breaks and expenditures that disproportionately benefit very wealthy people in the other breath, and then say they won't close one single tax loophole for wealthy people for the purpose of reducing the deficit. Not one dime in their budget for that purpose. And yet, they're willing to hit Medicaid to the tune of $110 billion. They're willing to hit the food and nutrition program by over $100 billion. They're ready to cut transportation funding by over 15% in this budget window. And yet they're not willing to close one of those more than $4 trillion in tax loopholes to reduce the deficit. I think that's wrong. Mr. Chairman, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, a member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Schwartz.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. The federal budget is a statement of our priorities and our values as a nation. The budget should be fiscally responsible and reduce the deficit. It should make investments to grow our economy, and it should meet our obligations to our seniors, to our families, and to our future. And the Republican budget fails all three. The Republican budget threatens our nation by undermining our economic growth and by shifting the financial burden for the deficit and for deficit reduction to our seniors and the middle class. Republicans have made their choices clear. End Medicare as we know it, adding costs to seniors today, and ending the Medicare guarantee tomorrow, slashing investments necessary for economic competitiveness and giving millionaires an average of $400,000 in tax breaks. The Republican budget eliminates protection for millions of our sickest, frailest seniors who depend on nursing home and home health services. And the Republican budget will increase taxes for average middle-class families by $3,000. Their choices will cost 2 million jobs next year alone and decrease economic growth by 1.7%. In contrast, the Democratic alternative preserves Medicare guarantee. It makes key investments in education, in innovation, and in infrastructure necessary for job creation and economic growth, and it protects the middle class from these large tax increases. The Democratic alternative reduces the deficit in a fiscally responsible way and a balanced way, without causing harm today and without threatening our economic competitiveness for the future. And it reduces the deficit while meeting our commitments to our seniors, to our frailest elderly, and to our children. I urge my colleagues to reject the Republican budget that threatens our seniors, our middle class, and our economic growth, and to vote for the Democratic alternative that builds on our great strengths as a nation: innovative, entrepreneurial business sector, skilled, hardworking middle class. Vote for the Democratic alternative that builds on hope, opportunity, and security for all Americans.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield myself 1 minute to quickly respond. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania said that we're ending Medicare as we know it. I got news for you. Obamacare ended Medicare as we know it. And what our budget does is it takes those savings from Medicare and it makes sure it stays in Medicare, that it doesn't go fund another program. Stop the rate of Medicare, make sure that those savings that the gentleman says are necessary and worthwhile stay with Medicare to make it more solvent, to extend the life of the trust fund and not double count it to rate it to spend on Obamacare. Loopholes. I enjoy this conversation because what we keep hearing is close loopholes for the purpose of deficit reduction. What it really means is take more money and spend it in Washington. We're saying close loopholes to lower tax rates for everybody. Problem with our tax code is it's not fair. If you have access, if you have good clout, you can get a loophole in the code and pay lower taxes. If you're a family sitting at home in Janesville, Wisconsin, you're paying whatever tax rate. We are saying the person or the business that has the same amount of income should pay the same kind of tax rate. And with that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman, a member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Williams from Texas.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, every business, every family, and every person in America eventually has to balance a budget. I am a small business owner. I still own a business. I've owned and operated my business for 41 years, and I balance my budget every month and in many cases every day. The government should be no different. Now, until we balance a budget, we don't know the true fiscal condition of our country or of a company or our family. It's just like a business that is over-leveraged or a family that is over-borrowed. Deficit spending can obscure the real picture. But eventually, the truth comes out. Once the numbers line up, you get an exact view of your fiscal condition. We've gone far too long without knowing our country's financial condition. In the last 4 years, we've had $1 trillion deficits. In 2011, our nation's credit rating was downgraded. And this year, our publicly held debt is on track to exceed 76% of GDP in 2013. Yet we still spend more money that we don't have, pushing the country towards a debt-driven financial crisis. If the federal government didn't have the ability to print money, we'd have a negative net worth, and we'd be in a weak financial position. A budget is a blueprint. A budget's a roadmap. It's a plan. Our nation's budget doesn't need to have balance as its end goal. It needs to be our starting point. It's the only way to guarantee that the public debt will not outgrow the economy, which would certainly crowd out private investment, raise interest rates, and increase inflation. Now, I'm proud to stand in support of the path to prosperity. It's a responsible, balanced budget that is right for America. This budget balances, cuts wasteful spending, and fixes our broken tax code, all without raising taxes. I applaud Chairman Ryan and my colleagues on the House Budget Committee for their tremendous work in presenting the American people with what they want, a budget that works. With this plan, we will apply the same principles that families and businesses use every day. And I predict our country's best financial days will surely be ahead of us, because unlike our Democratic friends, we balance. It means jobs, it means prosperity, and it means opportunity. Small business and the people of America are begging for this budget. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out to my colleagues that the Affordable Care Act, with the reforms it made to Medicare, we extended the life of the Medicare Trust Fund as part of that effort going forward. I'm happy to yield for a minute.
Does that mean that money is not going to fund Obamacare? And does that mean that there's a $716 billion hole in the funding of Obamacare?
That means, as in your budget, that we will help reduce the deficit by whatever amount it was. But what we do not do in our budget is fund tax breaks for folks at the very top by raising them on folks on the middle. Listen, let me just say one other thing, Mr. Chairman, here. We've had 4 balanced budgets in this country in the last 40 years. It wasn't under President Reagan, wasn't under the first President Bush, wasn't under the second President Bush. It was 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. It was under President Clinton, and then President Bush came in and did a big tax cut in 2001, put us out of balance for a long period of time. And during the period of time when the budget was in balance, the last 4 times out of 40 years, the revenue that was coming in was higher than it is in any year in the Republican budget that's before us now. And what that tells you is that their budget approach is trying to seek balance on the backs of everybody else by really cutting into those important investments that have helped power our economy, by violating important commitments to seniors, and in the end by raising taxes on middle-income people. Why else would they not have joined Democrats in sending a policy statement to the Ways and Means Committee that says when you go about eliminating tax preferences, don't hit middle-income taxpayers in the process. In fact, Mr. Chairman, if you look at the mortgage interest deduction, for example, mortgage interest deduction really helps middle-income people, homeowners. So in addition to saying, Ways and Means Committee, when you do tax reform, don't hit middle-income taxpayers, we specifically said, don't take away the mortgage interest deduction for middle-income taxpayers. Again, all our Republican colleagues voted against that. So they've been talking about tax reform for 3 years now. We've never seen a piece of paper from them as to how they would do it, which is why we wanted to make sure that they don't do it in certain ways that help middle-income people. But nope, can't do that. So let's make sure that as we address our deficit issues, we do it in a way that calls for shared responsibility, not another round of tax breaks for the wealthy on the backs of everybody else. And I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Wisconsin, one of our distinguished members of the Budget committee, Ms. Moore.
Gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask to unanimous consent to be able to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Well, you know, this is an austerity plan and an inequality plan, this Republican budget. And I want people to behold the plunder of suckling babes, the young, elderly, the infirm, women, community of colors, by $810 billion cuts in Medicaid, $135 billion in SNAP. It is not humorous to me. And I want you to beware of the claims that we're going to grow our economy by ending 750,000 jobs, by pillaring Pell Grants and cutting off educational opportunity to students. This is not a balanced budget. This is a budget blunder, which plunders us into double-dip recession. And I tell you, Ben Bernanke, our Fed chair, warns against these kinds of severe austerity cuts. And if you don't believe him, take the word of Plato. He said, in a state which is desirous of being saved from the greatest of plagues, there should exist among the citizens neither extreme poverty nor, again, excessive wealth, for both are productive of great evil. So we plunge poor people into poverty and give $245,000 tax breaks to the wealthiest. I think that qualifies for not only an austerity plan that could harm us, but it is the greatest inequality plan that this body has seen. And I would yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I think the reference to Plato reveals a mindset that the country ought to be run by a handful of philosopher kings instead of the people. I yield myself 10 seconds to simply say this budget, this plundering, evil, cutting budget, increases spending on average 3.4% a year instead of 5% a year. With that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished member of the Budget Committee, a gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, this debate over the budget reflects a great struggle between American families and their government over whether they or the government can best spend the money that they have earned. This budget bends that struggle slowly back in favor of those families by returning to them a little of the freedom to spend more of their own money and make more of their own decisions once again. The prosperity of American families is directly affected by government spending. Government cannot put a dollar into the economy that it first hasn't taken out of the economy. It's true we see the government job that's created when government puts that dollar back in. What we don't see as clearly is the job that's destroyed when government first pulls that dollar out. We see those lost jobs as chronic unemployment and a stagnating economy. Every $1 billion spent in Washington means taking $9 from an average family, either in direct taxes or in tax-driven price increases as businesses pass along their cost to consumers. That means that $1 trillion of new taxes, as the Senate has proposed, means $9,000 per family. Now, we're told, don't worry, that's all paid by businesses. But businesses don't pay business taxes. They only collect them. They pass them on to us as consumers through higher prices, to us as employees through lower wages, or to us as investors through lower earnings, usually on our 401ks. $1 trillion of deficit, as we ran up last year, really means $9,000 of future taxes for every family, robbing our children of their futures. It's about time we started thinking in these numbers as family-sized terms, because ultimately these numbers have a very real impact on families who are struggling to balance their own budgets, to set their own priorities, and to look after their own needs. You know, these days we pass more than a third of the cost of government on to our children, and we finance the remainder through a tax system in which politicians pick winners and losers through an appallingly unfair and distorted tax code. This budget calls for doing away with these tax distortions that reward some and punish others, distortions that shift capital away from economic expansion and into the service of political interests. And this budget calls for flattening and lowering tax rates to assure that no American family pays more than a quarter of its earnings to the federal government. Those nations that have adopted similar reforms have been rewarded with explosive economic growth. That means fairness for every American taxpayer and an economy unshackled from the burdens and political favoritism of our current system. In short, freedom works, and it's time that we put it back to work. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.